One of the tragedies that I've noticed, Alex, is that if you pitch an Argentinian or a Venezuelan or someone from Turkey, say, hey, here's Bitcoin, non-government money, cap supply, take self-custody, dude, it's like, where can I sign up? Like,
Yeah,
how can I
exactly.
sign up for this thing? And then in the US, it's like, why do I need that? Exactly.
Get that away from me.
Mm-hmm.
I could go to prison or whatever.
Yep.
Yeah, people.
Yep.
Well, it's financial privilege, dude. And I mean,
Mm-hmm.
eventually, though, like it comes. The chickens come home to roost or whatever. Like seriously, like as soon as like you get deplatformed or your something happens with your bank account or you start having trouble sending a wire abroad or I mean, you name it. There could be any number of like trigger items that get somebody to go into Bitcoin. I think those trigger moments are gonna like really intensify in volume over the coming years. Like you're gonna see a lot more deplatforming. You're gonna see a lot more have trouble, technical and liquidity trouble with traditional financial services. I mean, look at Lebanon. I mean, I think you're going to have trouble with both national and private banking. You're going to have crises in both. You're going to see a lot of issues moving money from A to B if there's conflict or a breakdown in trade or communications. Like you're just going to see a whole hell of a lot of problems, and every single one of those is like a moment that's going to mint a new Bitcoiner out of necessity. So this is why we have so many tens of millions of Bitcoiners, or at least people who use Bitcoin, I guess to say loosely. It might be paper Bitcoin, it might be custodial, etc. But at least they're on the journey. Let's put it that way. They're at the beginning of the journey. They're at the bottom of the hill, but they're climbing up the hill. Okay, you've got people climbing up the hill. You got tens of millions of these people climbing up the hill in a lot of the global South, right? And I hope they just get a head start. That would be the most like just thing, and the most historically perfect thing would be for the people who had been subjugated by colonial powers to get a better head start than their former masters. Like that would really be something. Mm-hmm. So that's like what I'm hoping for. I mean, who knows? Maybe it won't work out, but it certainly seems to be working in that direction at the moment, basically from what I've seen.
And I completely agree. It's beautiful in a way because it almost feels like cosmic justice.
That's what it is. Yeah, that's what it would be. But we don't know yet. And look, if the U.S. government, against all odds, if Gensler and Biden end up being able to, somehow win an arm wrestling match against the courts and the Congress, and they can impose some of this stuff in America, it causes a chilling effect, and those miners and devs and companies are just going to go somewhere else. And maybe it ends up being more like a cat and mouse or like a whack-a-mole game, but they're going to go to Taiwan, or they're going to go to some of these partially authoritarian places that allow that innovation for a certain amount of time for a political aim. But just don't. I would caution people when they think about a place like El Salvador or Singapore or Saudi Arabia or Dubai or whatever. Like, just know that you're there at the pleasure of the ruler, and like as soon as they're tired of you, like they're going to get rid of you. Now, maybe getting rid of you is bad for business, and maybe you do have a solid era there. But just be careful. But I do think that worst case, bad shit goes down in the United States. People just go elsewhere.
So that's the case you're making, and now I'm starting to understand you, Alex. Okay, so the case that you're making is, as long as things are politically aligned with these authoritarians, right? Whether it's Saudi Arabia, I love Bitcoin, but as soon as things go against them, is what you're making the case, that it becomes incredibly hard to fight them in those jurisdictions versus
impossible. Well, by the way, the only one who says I love Bitcoin is Bukele right now, which is again great, and I've been on record saying it was an awesome move for him to have Bitcoin as the national currency. Love the volcano mining, love the Bitcoin bonds, lots of good stuff. Love giving the middle finger to the IMF. I mean, the problem is that he's putting tens of thousands of people in prison without a due process. I mean, the problem is that he's spying on his opponents using Pegasus software. I mean, these are not. I mean, the problem is that he's changing the law so that he can rule forever. I don't know. He's a young guy. and he's getting rid of the independence of the courts and the attorney generals so that they stop investigating him. He's also stopping some really important investigation into war crimes in the 80s because whatever, he probably cut a deal with the military. The point is that like these are worrying trends if you're thinking about property rights in the future. As long as you keep your mouth shut, you don't criticize him, you're going to be fine, I think, in the near term. But you never know. Same thing in other places. Like if you're just some tourist or a client and you have a conference in Dubai and you keep your mouth shut about the government there, they're freaking delighted to have you. But as soon as you open your mouth about the government, watch out. Same thing in Singapore, same thing as any of these places. Whereas in the United States, it's like, I mean, you can go give a middle finger to Biden all day long and run your business. And like, I mean, generally speaking, you're going to be fine. It's just very, very different. And you could say the same thing in a bunch of other democracies, generally speaking. But look, the point is that where the democracies have broken down, I do think it's very clearly related to fiat currency. And I do think that Bitcoin fixes this in a way. Like I think Bitcoin fixes democracy is my point. If you were to put our conversation in 3 words, Bitcoin fixes democracy, because I think democracies have been disabled and infected with fiat currency essentially. And I think that they'll be much better off on the other side. Whereas I think tyrannies and police states are going to have a really hard time on the on the Bitcoin standard. Because basically, like if you think about what Bitcoin is, it's free speech, property rights, and open capital markets, these 3 things. So those vibe with the American values that America was founded on, the principles of the Declaration of Independence. But if you think about what tyrants need, or autocrats, or strongmen, they need the opposite. They need censorship, right? Censorship, confiscation, and closed capital markets. This is what China and Russia need to survive. They need censorship, they need closed capital markets, and they need confiscation. So Bitcoin makes it really hard for governments to impose those things on their people. So if you have like a political construct whose DNA resembles the values of Bitcoin, like I think that's going to vibe pretty nicely. We're talking 30, 40 years out. So I don't see these like dictatorial powers doing that well in a Bitcoin standard. I think it becomes really hard for them.
Yeah. Interesting. It's fascinating. It's just one of those things like Bitcoin fixes this. So
Yeah.
you were talking about it earlier, where just way before in the beginning of the conversation, but I was meaning to ask you, but we just, got carried away in this conversation. About the IMF and the World Bank, we know how the current system works. What would be the alternative to that system?
Yeah, so look, in a Bitcoin standard, you could still have a global lender of last resort, and you could still have like a supranational lending institution that would help in poor countries, but they would be very limited in terms of their power. They would really have to think carefully about the loans. They'd have to be pretty prudent. If a client country has continually said, no, we're not paying you back, instead of bailing them out again with this like infinite fiat machine that we've been able to do, we have to let them go bankrupt, which is a healthy part of capitalism, right? The problem is like in our world, what's happened is that the banks that are the ultimate creditors of, let's say, the World Bank or the IMF, et cetera, the Western private banks, the loan that they make that eventually goes to these third world countries is an asset on their balance sheet. So they don't want to see that go to zero. They would rather, when like Mobutu in Zaire, when he was like, thanks for the money, a couple years later they come to collect and he was like, I don't got it. Rather than let him go bankrupt and write off the loan, like there was pressure from like the creditor side to just create another loan and just to keep the party going. And that's why you've seen the external debt of the third world go from, I don't know what it was like, 100 billion or something in the early 1970s, around when the fiat standard began, and today it's like got like many trillion dollars. I have all the data in my piece, but we're talking about an exponential rise in external debt, where countries would have a couple $100 million, and now they have $100 billion in external debt, and that's because like instead of whenever they did fail, instead of going bankrupt, starting over again, they would just get another loan, and this, you know, would go forever. That's not possible in a Bitcoin standard. So I think the lenders have to be a lot more careful, more prudent. I think World Bank projects would have a lot more skin in the game. Like the people investing in it would have to like actually assess, like, is this going to work? Is this going to make money? Or is this going to be some like failed project that the local government's just going to like take 30% off the top and let it rot in the jungle afterwards? Like this is like, so I think it's possible these things still exist in terms of what they were founded to do. I just think that they have like a little bit more limited of an influence, which is healthy. I don't think they should have dramatic influence over these countries.